Hey guys, are you looking for some new headphones? Well, look no further. Studio is a company out of Sweden that aims to revolutionize the way that people see headphones, not just as a tech device, but also as an accessory. Right now, you can really only get headphones that can offer you one of two things, either style or tech. So Studio is going to bring you those fashionable headphones that actually give you proper sound quality and have those high-tech variations that you've been looking for. Now, Studio's been kind enough to offer our listeners 15% off. So if you head on over to studio.com and enter masculinity, that is all caps with a K, of course, as your discount code, you'll receive 15% off. Studio is out of Sweden, but they ship for free worldwide, so take advantage of that. I'm wearing my Studio headphones all day, every day now, and I love them. So please be sure to take advantage of that opportunity.
Hey guys, my name is Samantha Nzesi, and this is Masculinity. It's just me this week. I'm just really excited that it's been a whole year since Ramoy and I have started the Masculinity podcast, and I couldn't be more grateful for the listeners that we have, for the amazing guests who have stuck on the show. And while we've already finished season 2, we thought this would be a great opportunity to just kind of take a look back and see all of the things that we learned, all of the action items that our illustrious guests have given us, and all the things that we can do to move forward. So thank you for listening to our Masculinity Mashup. So we're going to jumble it up a little bit, but one of the main things that we learned this season is about how masculinity and the performance of masculinity more specifically are super intertwined with white supremacy. And so let's just listen to Dr. Lou and Eric Bussey of Scouts for Equality drop the knowledge on us.
There's like a certain kind of fabric that we're trying to maintain. And I think that's kind of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, is because when I was talking to you at the event, I was like, this is so American. This is so Make America Great Again American.
Right.
So
I completely agree. And so what you're really pointing at is what my primary concern in this work is that the BSA in the way that they have interacted with the law, the way that they have continually dug in their heels in terms of maintaining their discriminatory policies is a direct result, in my opinion, of them coupling what it means to be a person of character, to be a person of moral development, with being a person of upper white, Judeo-Christian, cis, straight dominance.
Yeah.
Right. And so that it's that coupling of morality with patriarchy and hegemony that, and like the preservation of that conflation is what has resulted in this, really shameful history of discrimination and resistance to change. And so what we're interested in doing is decoupling, right? The Scout law. A Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. We need to decouple all those words, which in and of themselves are not, not bad things, but they have been combined with straight, white, a certain kind of family structure, a certain kind of way of speaking, all of these things. We need to decouple those words from those origins. And I think only once we achieve that will be on, the BSA will be able to be a truly powerful and ethical force in this country again.
Hegemony is often confused with this idea that it is strictly about oppression. In other words, it's strictly about ruling society through direct oppression, and that's not necessarily what hegemony means. Hegemony actually is not necessarily the rule of society through coercion. It's actually the rule of society through consent. And hegemony means because if society was built on this idea that there was a ruling class and an oppressed class, it wouldn't function very well, because you would have these constant revolutions all the time, because you could figure out the boundaries between the oppressed class and the oppressor class, right? The boundaries would be very clear. But hegemony is much more complex, because hegemony is really the rule of society, the oppression and racism of society that's naturalized, that becomes a natural part of society, that we consent to being ruled, and we consent to racism in some ways, right? In many ways, we consent to sexism, we consent to classism, we really, in a sense, consent to economic inequality, let's say, right? And in order to do that, you really have to create a middle class. You really have to create a middle group that owes its power and prestige and privileges and status to the upper class, but is not quite the oppressed class, right? And so they're this middle class. Yeah. So if you have a large middle class, you have this middle group of folks that that believe that they earned what they have, that they believe in meritocracy, that they believe in working hard and that society is fair, then what they start to tell people in the lower class is, look, you could be middle class if you do what we're doing. If you
Right, they kind of almost funnel the dogma and funnel the ideologies
they
from
do, right?
between classes, right?
They funnel the ideology between classes, and so
they maintain that, like, they actively benefit from this system being maintained the way that it is, at the detriment of the people who are oppressed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anybody who fully believes in meritocracy, the research shows that they're also going to fundamentally believe in fairness and inequality. In other words, if you believe you work for what you got, you're also going to believe that there's legitimacy in inequality, right? Because they're the group that's going to say, well, clearly you didn't work hard enough, or clearly you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, because if you did what you're supposed to be doing, you'd be in the middle class with us, you'd be successful and you could send your kids to college. Like, as an Asian American man growing up, as a boy and adolescent growing up, I was also learning, as I'm learning about what it means to be a boy, an adolescent, a man in our society, part of that learning piece is all my role models are white men.
Sure.
All the expectations of what it means to be a man in our society are white masculinity, white men all around me, right? And all the practices that are laid out in front of me about how I'm supposed to be are about things that are congruent with white masculinity, the ways that white men practice their own masculinity. And there's not a lot out there about what it means to be an Asian American man, or just generally a man of color. What does that
Well, and it's not positioned as right. It's positioned as wrong or not right. Right. We're positioned, our heroes and the culture, that what is culturally observed as correct or right. Like, be correct is to be white. And especially as a man or someone who's performing masculine traits,
right,
you were taught one way, and that is whiteness. And that's an inextricableness between white supremacy and masculinity. And I think we've touched upon this, but can you talk about kind of the connective tissue of consent or hegemony?
I hope I'm going to answer this question. I think we consent to it because there are explicit and implicit rewards tied to those behaviors and those practices. That, for instance, if you want a job, if you want to succeed in that job or in that institution, you have to perform masculinity in a particular way. And if you're not, then you're not considered a good fit in that institution, or you're not considered a good team player in those institutions, right? So there are measurable, meaningful economic rewards tied to masculinity. It's not enough to say, I'm gonna. You can't go into an institution necessarily and say I'm gonna practice my masculinity the way that I want it, because there are very few institutions like that. There are very few social systems like that allow it. The ones that are the most powerful ones are still very white, right? They're the big economic powerhouses, the big educational powerhouses are still governed by white people and whiteness and white culture and white masculinity. And if you want to be able to be successful in those spaces, you've got to learn very quickly what is being expected of you, what you can perform, what you can do in those spaces, and how you can survive. And I think for some men of color, I'll just use myself as an example. When I walk in through the doors of my college, for instance, I know that I'm expected to be a particular way, and I can perform that piece. But at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. I'm tired.
It is exhausting.
It is exhausting, right? So when we say it's exhausting, it's tiring, it's fatiguing, right? And researchers have talked about that as sort of racial battle fatigue, because it's this constant like managing of your impression, right? And in those white dominant cultural spaces, it's a relief when you can find somebody that sort of has very similar cultural values to you, or sense of being that's similar to yours, and you sort of close your office door, and then you sort of like let go, and sort of for myself, your vernacular changes. You start to talk about things a little bit differently, and then when you're done, you open the door and
the
you're
code
back.
switching. Yep.
It's a lot of that, right? And so it's exhausting to be in those spaces. And so there are very few spaces where we're allowed to just be who we are. And even when that's the case, the research shows that very quickly you become tokenized, right? You become you become the hypervisible, let's say, African American man in that space, and you're given a little bit of space to perform a different kind of masculinity. But with that hypervisibility and that tokenism comes also increased scrutiny about your behaviors, right? And so there are very few. There are very few men that can do that. There are very few cultural spaces that can do that. But if you're a white man, you have a lot more range of behaviors to be yourself and to perform who you want to be as a white man.
Yeah.
And most of that is either excused, accepted, and if it is excused, it's excused via this idea that if they did something wrong, then we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't mean it, or they didn't really intend for that to be that way, and so we'll excuse it. We'll give them a one-off and let them go from that. And so there's a lot more humanity in its approach. But for men of color, that hypervisibility, that scrutiny comes with a much more direct consequence. Right? There's a much more direct sort of response to it. And so
we also had a chance to talk to Dr. Obari Cartman about the ways that inequality is systematized through our educational systems, and how a lot of times after the educational system has failed young men and boys, it turns into an incarceration cycle that affects families intergenerationally. And we talked about that with Alejo Rodriguez.
On average, there's about 10% of the 8th grade boys that are performing at proficient level in terms of their literacy. And the reason that's important, that age range, 8th grade, is important because at that age, like, they've been children the whole time. So somebody might see that and say, well, that just confirms what I thought, which is that Black boys are less capable they're less intelligent, they have less desire to perform and to be scholars. But by eighth grade, if you think about an eighth grader, you look at them, you see the kid in their eyes. You're reminded they've been children the whole time up until eighth grade, and so what that means is that they've been failed from first through eighth grade. Somebody did not do their job. That the school systems did. The school systems failed. Not the kids failed, but the school systems failed. Or if you're going to be cynical about it, they performed their duty properly. If the idea is that they're designed to be cogs in a machine of the status quo, then they're not broken and they're actually just doing what they're designed to do. Either way, they set the young people up to not be able to be successful and to not be able to use literacy as one basic tool to be able to navigate a system that requires finances to be able to have power in the system, power as agency, and to be able to feed children and to be able to have houses and mortgages and healthcare, like just basic kind of stuff. That literacy is a requirement for that. And so if a system is failing you and it puts you in a disadvantage at eighth grade, then sends you to high school at a disadvantage, then what you're speaking to just before about the lack of real power, then having to compensate for that is a byproduct of the education system not doing its job for Black boys in particular. So the reading levels that low for that group in particular just speaks to a particular type of failing that a system is doing for these kids. And they don't see it like that. People don't see it like that. People just, we have this very individual analysis. They need to do better, work harder, pull their pants up, say the right things, put a bow tie on, and then everything will be fine. But not thinking about what it means to be in a system where there's literal opposition at every way. And opposition sometimes look like the police or sometimes look like mass incarceration. But if it's school, it's harder to see it because school is supposed to be a good place. You got to send your kids to school. We still do it, even if we know what the numbers are. But if we know that school's not preparing them, then that should challenge us to think, how do we compensate for that as a community? How do we supplement what the school's not doing? And for the reading levels, we're just talking basic ABCs at this point. Ideally, what we need to be talking about are having the schoolhouses be responsible for using the 8 hours they have in the day to also teach social emotional development, to also teach proper historical context, to also teach current social, political, economic context to really help the young people see the world they're living in. And in lots of ways, the schools and the teachers and the staff aren't equipped to do that because the training does not give them that. But if we want people to come out of school whole human beings, prepared for a world that is competitive and demanding and requires a certain amount of agency, then the school has to be accountable for doing that kind of prep that it is very clearly has not been doing.
People have been frustrated with their systems before. Blacks and Hispanics, as again, New Jim Crow points out, are not the only ones using drugs, but we're the ones being criminalized behind it.
Right.
So it's clear that there's a connection between in the intergenerational effect. And Samantha, you made out a very good point in terms of dealing with the frustrations and then not knowing what to do with that.
Right.
And this is where I think is very significant in terms of the term, our sense of masculinity. And I really didn't get it. Like I got it when you asked me to be here, and then you said it's masculinity spelled with a K. And I said, okay, cool. But when I seen it, masculinity, that in much respects is the idea that the mask is more predominant than any kind of representation of our manhood. That there's more of a mask there, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And how was that mask created? How was that mask actually not only is it created but supported? And one of the things I shared with you before was, like, say for an example, it's very common we learn, as men, boys not supposed to cry, right? It's very common. I use it as an example. But what's clear, and people say, well, that's not fair to the boy. He's not human. He is human. It's not a real emotion and all that. Don't cry. And we're not even having a discussion. Okay, well, what do you do then? Like, what do you do besides, because it's as if we only can deal with anger and pain, and anger and hurt. And so what do you do when you're frustrated, depressed, lonely, sad, right? What do you do when you have these feelings? And we're not even having this discussion amongst it as men, right? And so the reaction has been to claim and cling to certain vices.
Right.
The getting high, domestic violence, beating of women, objectifying women.
Yeah.
The issue of, we talk about how the police brutality has been, come to a claim. This police brutality has been around, like the whole Rodney King situation. All that did was evidence that, listen, you guys, this has been happening, and you've been saying we're lying, but now this is evidence. And we get evidence after evidence after evidence, and it keeps happening, right?
Yeah.
So we know that's really significant. But the other thing, too, is that we're also killing each other at very significant rates.
Yeah.
And so how much are we holding that accountable in this?
We had a chance to talk to Rima Sharma of Saki about another way that our notions of masculine impact us in this country, which is through immigration and the trauma of immigration and how that in turn impacts the way that men deal with women and like their wives and their daughters at home.
I think that people who might not come from immigrant families don't realize the trauma of immigrating.
Oh, it's incredibly traumatic.
Yeah, and I think that just amplifies so many emotions. And I think this is another issue, right? And a particular South Asian community and other immigrant communities, I'm sure, is like this lack of addressing this sort of trauma and like mental health issues. And so what happens, I think, is like a lot of it is like a fear, right? And I think a lot of what I noticed in my family, for example, is that my parents are more like they clung on to their culture more here. Like in some ways, like I hear my cousins in India date, like they chose their husbands, you know?
Right.
And my parents, they have love marriages, and my parents here are like, no. Yeah. And so I think a lot of that comes from fear, and I think that comes from sticking to like these ideas that you have about your culture, your identity, because it's like constantly questioned when you're in a different country and you're constantly, trying to reconcile these differences. And I think like it is like amplified when it comes to gender relations, like I think that like a lot of immigrant men are, especially South Asian masculinity, a lot of it in the U.S. seems to be about emasculating, And I think one way of like regaining power is to be like, at least I'm not a woman. And so like that becomes a thing, that becomes a thing in the home environment where you're like, well, I can still exert my power over my wife. I think that it's clearly patriarchy that's like the root cause, because everything, when you're putting men in these like high stress traumatic situations, the fact that they revert to hypermasculinity or have like try to reclaim identity, but it's like always through their masculineness, I think that reflects that that's what they feel that they have to offer. And like that's what they have to like go to, or that's how they define themselves, is this, masculinity. And I feel like that is just because that's the way society has deemed them like valuable, and I think like as an immigrant, we were talking a little about narratives. Like the immigrant narrative is like, when you're here and you have to make something out of nothing, that responsibility, because it's like part of masculinity, like men are supposed to be providers. So what happens when you can't do that?
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. What happens when you can't do that, but then your partner, who you've known your whole life to not be in that role, is given the opportunity and does better than you? What do you do?
Right, and you have to reevaluate what it means to, like what your masculinity could mean, and instead of usually changing it, most people seem to be reverting or like, or like clinging to, I don't know.
And I think that we've talked about this multiple times, but this is what it means to be in an immigrant family. Like there's so much trauma and so much stress with trying to survive and adapt in a completely new culture or context, that you lack that tools and resources and the space, the mental, emotional space to really think about what's going on. And you're just constantly reacting, and you're reverting back again to this rule book that we call patriarchy.
Hey guys, are you looking for some new headphones? Well, look no further. Studio is a company out of Sweden that aims to revolutionize the way that people see headphones, not just as a tech device, but also as an accessory. Right now, you can really only get headphones that can offer you one of two things, either style or tech. So Studio is going to bring you those fashionable headphones that actually give you proper sound quality and have those high-tech variations that you've been looking for. Now, Studio's been kind enough to offer our listeners 15% off. So if you head on over to studio.com and enter masculinity, that is all caps with a K, of course, as your discount code, you'll receive 15% off. Studio is out of Sweden, but they ship for free worldwide, so take advantage of that. I'm wearing my Studio headphones all day, every day now, and I love them. So please be sure to take advantage of that opportunity.
We also had the opportunity to talk to Imran Siddiqui about how our notions of masculinity are so based on the movies and music videos that we watched in the past, and how important it is to challenge those, and specifically how important it is to talk to people who are not cisgendered heterosexual men about masculinity.
Like, I remember, same things y'all are talking about. I love Michael Jackson, and I love Saved by the Bell. And you see it come up in those shows, but it's so much older. We're talking about Gone with the Wind, but you go back all the way to the beginning of cinema. To like the
jazz singer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you see that this whole system, I think that's the key, is that the system of production of Hollywood films was created from the perspective of straight, cisgender, white men. And that had an impact on the way that the norms of how you make a film were created. So the perspective of the camera, the way that some of the most famous shots in film history are panning up women's bodies, like the femme fatale of the 40s. Like, you look at how the language of cinema was created from that perspective, so that the behaviors which men were already taught to do in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. They just were replicating their experiences on camera and glorifying them. And so we started to see
the male gaze,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Like the whole, yeah.
So then we started to see that, like, love stories, which have always been some of the most popular types of films made, but they've almost always been made by those straight cis white men, and we often don't make that connection because we think of, like, we call them chick flicks, but the people who have been making chick flicks from last 100 years have mostly been men, and so men have been creating this vision of love based on their own experiences, which is living in a world, a larger system that teaches men that dominance is the way to be a real man, and that's how you're romantic. So then I think that's how we got to a place where it's so ingrained that we think it's cute in a romantic comedy because, well, yeah, I mean, comparative to, like, someone, in an action film where men don't even express any emotions or, like,
and
at
that's
all.
supposed to be sexy.
Yeah, that's supposed to be sexy. In a romantic film, you get a lot of credit just for doing, like, nothing. Like, there was a quote about someone wrote about Jerry Maguire, and it's like, in Jerry Maguire, all he had to do was show up to be forgiven. And that, to me, that's like a thing in romantic films, is the guy just shows up at the end, like, I'm sorry, and then it's like,
you're forgiven. I love you forever.
It's not only that; it's also, wow, you're so expressive. You're a different kind of man than I'm used to, but that we get to that point because the standard, which has been created from a certain perspective, is so low. So often, the solutions which we've presented is that, oh, men, you need to go talk to other, straight cis men, and y'all need to figure this out by yourself, which is, I do agree that men need to do this work and challenge themselves and each other, but to suggest that we can't learn from women's experiences or from, non-binary folks and like other people's experiences with masculine people is absurd, and actually plays into this patriarchal idea that only men have knowledge or have solutions. Sure. And, like, in reality, the people who we've interacted with our whole lives often can provide us more perspective on where we should be going than we can, and and obviously we're stuck in this conditioning, and I just think it's so important to listen to other people's experiences with people like us to learn how to be better, because the idea that only men can teach us how to be men plays into the idea that that there's such a thing as a real man.
Sure.
I just want to go. Last week, we talked to Dilo, and I found this article about how we can learn a lot about masculinity and the performance of masculinity. Well, maybe not the performance masculinity. We added performance masculinity, but from talking to trans men and, like, understanding trans men's experiences, which I appreciate it, and I'm behind, and like maybe this is just me doing it, but I also want to like address this notion of like, you know, men not doing their own emotional research and their own and practicing their like, you know, their own emotional discovery. And I think that it's like a fine line and like a balance between basically doing the work yourself and then also making sure that as we're, you know, as we're all doing the work or as men are doing that work, that they're including other perspectives in the mix, I guess, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think also like, I think about, you know, if you look at, you know, nowadays there's a few more people in popular media talking about masculinity, or what we often see this term redefining masculinity. But often they fall into this trap, especially those who are maybe new to the conversation, by saying like, no one's ever been talking about this. We should talk about this, you know? And I see that a lot amongst straight cis men who are writing about this. They'll say like, you know, this is a conversation we should be having because, you know, women have been talking about their stuff this whole time. We need to talk about this. But what I just always want to throw in there is that women have been talking about it for like decades and decades, centuries, you know, like, you know, black women have been writing about masculinity in America for, you know, at least 50, 60, 70 years, you know, and that's what I mean is that you go back and you read that stuff before we come in and say, hey, you know, I just had a thought, like maybe this is messed up, this thing that I do. You know, it's like, well, go back and read, you know, Audre Lorde Bell Hooks, and like they were talking about this way before you were born, telling you how to be. The problem was that no man in your life ever showed you that book and said, yo, read this instead of what I'm telling you. And the problem is always that men come in and say, I know how to raise a boy because I was a boy. But frankly, I don't know how to raise a boy because I was raised a boy in this culture. And this culture is fucked up. So, you know, what we need to do is read other people's thoughts, because often, you know, other people have more empathy for their, you know, the world. And if we take it back to film, the way that film impacts this in a way is that if film is a way to learn empathy, because you sit in that theater, you have to look at the screen, you have to put yourself in the character's shoes. If you think about it from this perspective, from a young age, most of the movies we watch are starring white men or cis white boys. So what we're being taught from a young age is empathy for them.
Yeah.
And in the same way, women are taught from birth have many more experiences being forced to feel empathy for men who don't express themselves than men ever have for women and for other people of other genders. So that's why I think it's so important that we challenge this notion that only men can teach us how to be men, because most men don't know how to be men.
So what does it look like through all of this for men to actually seek support, right? I mean, the performance in masculinity generally keeps them from doing that, but eventually, hopefully they do. And we had the chance to talk to Matt Mayhew, who is a creative therapist and a recovery specialist, about that very notion, and also to Justin Leoy about what it looks like for men to provide support to the people in their lives.
The men's group is a safe space to talk about men's issues without judgment. You know, I start the groups by reminding everybody there's no judgment here. That said, we need to watch what we say terminology-wise and things like that, because we want this to be the safe space for us to talk. And we explore a variety of issues from men's health, taboo things like erectile dysfunction. Some of these psychiatric medications, the antipsychotics, have sexual ramifications.
Right. And that's debilitating for men.
It is. You don't feel like a man if you can't get it up. It's frightening. And this is a place where we allow the safe discussion of men's topics. A lot of the topics are around women and interacting with women, because these men who come from a variety of backgrounds, but a lot are poverty-stricken, lack of education, homeless, substance abuse is rampant. They didn't learn. They don't know what's appropriate to say, and they need a safe space to be told maybe that's not the right way to approach a woman, and then have other people sort of share more appropriate ways to talk to women, to talk to potential mates. And all of the men in my men's group just happen to be cisgendered men. But I am very careful of the terminology I use. Often they will use women, but I want it to be safe to people who identify in various ways without having to force them to say, I date men or I sleep with men or something like that. So I say a partner, I say people, I say folks. I don't say guy, dude. I try to avoid that terminology for two reasons. One, to create that safe space, and second, to model what it is to be aware of other people's situations, other people's needs. And that's that non-direct, non-defensive way of educating people. I'm not challenging what they know.
Or what they've learned or how they've learned it.
Or what they've learned or how they've learned it. I just show them what it is to be aware.
Right.
And if there's that modicum of awareness, that tiny little bit that changes in one person, then we have changed the world. As far as I'm concerned, if one person changes their behavior in a certain way or the way they talk in a certain way, even though it's not the way they were raised, the way they were taught, or the environment or community that they go back to. Some of these guys go back to some of the toughest homeless shelters in New York City, where many words are very appropriate. And they go back there, and now they're a little bit more aware of what they say and who they say around and things like that. Maybe in some situations looking at masculinity as a defense mechanism in a lot of ways, and a protective factor, is really may help us sort of change the way we approach education about masculinity, you know, looking at it as a defense, like I had been saying about confronting it head on and a little too aggressively rebuilds those walls of masculine, you know, you want to, what, go outside, you know, something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think that if we, as a people, as groups, start looking at it in that way as more of a defense, not just a choice, we may be able to have the dialogues that are important, that are necessary.
You could teach whatever you want. You could say whatever you want, but your kids are learning the most from watching you, from how you're modeling. So are you modeling this person who is the hero who sacrifices everything for everyone else? Well, your kids, your sons as well as maybe your daughters, are going to grow up and think that is what an adult does, and that's what I'm going to do. So do you want your kids to do that when they grow up? And maybe you do, but if you don't, because you know that it's killing you and that you're now sitting in a therapist's office because you're trying to figure out like why you're having this weird physical thing that the doctors can't figure out, or why you're so angry all the time, you don't have to pass on that legacy. And the way to do that is by modeling the compassion, by modeling sadness, by modeling anger. Like, I know a lot of parents who don't get angry in front of my kids. I won't cry in front of my kids. We won't fight in front of the kids. Okay, well then how are your kids going to learn how to be sad? How are your kids going to learn how to get angry in a healthy way? How are they going to learn how to have a healthy fight with the person they love? Like, yeah, I mean, there are times you have the kids go out of the room. I'm not saying no boundaries at all.
Sure, like it'll teach a kid how to like again, diminish certain feelings and then privately let them manifest or exacerbate into something else that is way more problematic than initially. And I think this modeling thing of what is healthy is very key, because I didn't have that growing up, and I feel in the moment thinking like, shit, a lot of things came not say what my mom or my grandparents or family taught me, but what I saw them, how they enacted certain things, and it's the same exact thing I'm doing in my life currently. Yeah.
And the thing is, you take it on as something's wrong with you as a kid. So if you're 15 and something happens to a friend or a relationship and you want to cry, and you've gone 15 years with seeing your dad never cry, your impulse to cry is like, something's wrong with me. I need to hide this thing from everyone else, especially dad, but like I cannot show this. And then it just reinforces it. And that comes out somewhere else, and often in anger or self-harm or something else, because these things are just so unacceptable because I can't show them. And then we're back in the shame wheelhouse again.
Finally, we were super proud and excited to talk to some amazing women about the performance of masculinity as athletes. Julie Henderson and Houston Bruce came through and talked to us about their experiences as professional athletes and what it's like to call on masculinity and femininity.
I mean, I think it being a safe space to enact my more masculine traits, I think that's definitely, it comes out it's the healthiest way for it to come out for me. And I definitely feel like a very feminine woman. I don't ever feel feminine. You know, I'll like rock a sleeveless with my fucking jacked ass arms and like red lipstick. Like it's not two separate things for me. When people comment, I'm like, and sometimes I'm like thrown off guard. You know, they'll be like, oh yeah, do you box? And I'm like, what? I'm like, I look so fat. I look so nice right now. I don't look aggressive. I'm such a nice girl. But I'm like, oh, right, because of the muscles. Like that just automatically means that I'm aggressive or that I have anger problems or something. I get that a lot. Yeah. But as I was talking to you guys about before, like I definitely have parts of my personality that I don't like as much and that I want to sort of choke down or try to work through. And those are the more masculine things. And like I have an older brother that picked on me, et cetera, et cetera. Like I always feel like I needed to bring myself a little more to be able to be on everyone else's level. Or if I get uncomfortable in a social situation, I'll start swearing a lot for no reason. But that's where it comes out. I don't get shy. I get bigger.
It's more of like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and like we went out to dinner the other night, and when the check came, like I got weird, and because there was a lovely, amazing woman who just said something like, she was about to say, oh, but I only had X. And I thought that meant she was going to pay less. And before she even said anything else, I was like, nah, bitch, we're all paying it equal. Like, you got to like, and I just like strong-armed the whole situation. And I've been thinking about that since like I saw you. It was a really ugly moment. And I didn't know how to like apologize or like, because I don't think I was wrong for saying that, but I just like
do that though. I hate
totally,
that.
And I could see it starting, and I just got like, I was like, I can't deal with this right now. Like, please, let's just like be fair. You know, you might have to pay a little more than you probably
and tax and tip.
Exactly. Thank you very much. So that almost started to happen, and I just like strong-armed the situation so it wouldn't, and that was really ugly and like not okay. And that's where like that masculine, I would say that masculine, like like no, I got this kind of thing comes out. So, you know, I'm not always like maybe the most feminine in those situations, but I do feel that being able to bring my strong body to the world is something that is me using my masculine energy for a way that's like in a more positive way for sure.
But would you say your strong body is like a fine line between masculine and feminine? To me, your body is strong. It's still feminine. Like you said how we link it automatically. A strong body means masculine. Where to me, a strong body, we give birth. You know, how strong can you be? Yeah. That's like, we're the warriors of the world. Actually, it's the miracle of life. And even, so I guess to me, it's a very fine line. What does it mean to be masculine and feminine anyways? What does it mean to embody?
Well, that I guess I just don't ever feel weak. I don't feel like I'm never less than. It's kind of like what you were saying. And so I feel like that's me, like as opposed to having like bark down something, I'm able to just like be present.
Oh, but you consider that more of a masculine trait than a female trait?
I mean, I guess it just kind of came out of my mouth that way. Okay. But
no, I'm just wondering.
No, that's a good clarification.
Questions for myself too. So.
Yeah.
So thank you guys so much for listening to our anniversary Mashup episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do communicate with us. Let us know if there are some things that you really wish we had included in there, your favorite moments, the moments that you think deserve more attention. Our social media, always Masculinity Pod on Twitter. That's with a K, Masculinity Podcast on Facebook. You can feel free to email us at masculinitypodcast@whoistheo.com. My name is Samantha Zessi. It is a joy to be the host of this podcast, and I hope that you guys keep on listening and pass the word along. Drop us a couple of reviews, a couple of stars, maybe a lot of stars on iTunes, and we'll see you guys next season. Ciao.